Right, I'm here for another episode of Thorinquiry, and my guest for this one is going to be Andrei Taraschuk, who is a Russian programmer who, it's going to say, this is one of those ones I have to set up a little bit because obviously your name isn't something that's going to leap off the page. Basically, this is an individual who made a bunch of art bots for Twitter that post art of famous dead artists, in some cases not even always super duper famous. And the way I found your work was, funnily enough, we're going to get into this in a second, but it sounds like I had a very similar origin story as to why you made the art bots. So I thought maybe we could jump in there just with the reason why the art bots exist to begin with, Andrew, before we get into your background, which is, I will say, when I was reading some of the articles in different websites about this project and why you did it and your motivations, it sounds like we have a similar story because many times on Twitter, I've tried looking up specific artists and seeing like, oh, has anyone ever made like an account for this guy? Or is there like, do they have a foundation that posts things? But even when they do, and it's pretty rare with artists, I've got to say, you've got to be like really famous ones usually. Either it's just a very standard bot that is essentially just not even really a bot in the sense you're talking about. It's just a script that just posts the same images in a row or the same 3 images over and over again or retweets them. And half of them are dead as well. Like maybe someone made it 5 years ago, but now it's not active, or it was active for a few years, but it no longer is. So you follow it, but you think it's never going to get updated. Or the other thing is, I noticed as well, like you mentioned in some of these articles, the other angle is you find someone who's an art fan who posts loads of great art, but then the problem is their personal account and you have to read all of their thoughts about everything not related to the art, which you might not be into because you might not know who they are or care, right? So it sounds like you had a similar premise, right? You came to the internet and you were initially you were just sort of like, where's all the art, right?
Yeah, appreciate the introduction, Thorin. Really excited to be here. Yeah, before I jump into that, I just want to clarify that, I was born in the Soviet Union back in the day, but for the past, 20 plus years, I've been here in the United States. So it's been a journey. But yeah, to jump back to the art, the the question for me was, hey, what's the easiest way for me to connect with art? And so in the age of social media, I went to Twitter and I started looking, how do I follow artists or museums? And what I discovered is that there was not an easy way to. There was actually no way to follow art for the art's sakes,
Yes.
right? You either follow an art critic who is too highbrow for me, or you follow an art curator that, in addition to art, shares their own personal thoughts and ideas. And I really don't care. I'm here for the art. And so seeing that there's nothing like that, I thought, oh yeah, how hard would it be to create an automated account, load it with art, and just follow it? And this is what I did. So almost 8 years ago, I started a couple of these art accounts, and I just followed them myself. And I quickly realized that other people wanted that too, right? And so
Sure.
little by little, a community formed around these accounts, and I kept making them better and better. And years later, it's a huge network of art bots.
Sure. I mean, I noticed also that you also openly say that the first artist you thought of for this was Kandinsky, who's obviously a well-known one. Is there something specific about why was he the first one? Was he just your favorite? Was there something about his that you wanted to share with the world? Was there just not much of it online? But why him specifically?
Well, I had all these top artists, right? Like when I knew Picasso and I knew Van Gogh and Frida Kahlo, but I wanted to, like, I knew of Kandinsky and I knew his work, but again, I realized that I only know maybe one or two of his pieces. And so I thought I really, I wanted to dive deeper into Kandinsky and learn more about his work. And so he was the first art account that I set up.
Yes.
So yeah, like familiarity, but also curiosity.
Yeah, another thing I also found very interesting, which is different. Like I said in the preamble, even if you find an account that's called like something vaguely to do with the name of the artist, it's a bunch of repostings. Typically, they're just the most famous ones, or it's like there might not even be many pictures on the account. Maybe there's only 4 or 5 pictures on the account. It just cycles through them. I noticed another thing with your approach, like you just said there, is each one's also supposed to give you a deeper sense of the artist. It's not just Van Gogh sunflowers. There'll be like a sketch of his, or maybe a piece that was unfinished. I noticed you also tried to give people like more of a sense of their whole oeuvre of work, right? Not just at the top 2 or 3 pieces, right?
Yeah, and so this is something that I also realized very quickly is that when when regular folks like us, right, not art majors or art critics, um, when we think about art, right, we only think about these masterpieces, these world famous works, right? So like
Yes.
For Monet, it could be water lilies. For Van Gogh, it could be sunflowers. But really, these artists were so prolific. Like for example, Monet has over 1,000 artworks in our
Wow.
database,
Okay.
and I realized how little I actually knew and how few artworks have I actually seen,
Yes.
even by the top artists, right? And so because and this is what you see a lot on Instagram, right? Like a lot of these art accounts, they repost the top of the top. So you only really get to see 1% or even less than 1% of all the art.
Yes.
And my goal was to expose the whole breadth of work. So it could be work from very beginning of artist's career. It could be sketches. It could be really anything that we have on them. I try to share through those accounts.
One thing I actually
And
want to, oh, sorry. By the way, just as an aside, it's sometimes tricky to know when you finish. So if I jump in like that too early, don't worry. Keep going, mate.
yeah, and but then also, right? It's not always the most popular stuff, right? These artists, they created a lot of work that wasn't that good or that
Sure.
beautiful, and so if you're here only to get the most engagement, it makes sense why people
Absolutely.
post
Yes.
only the
Yeah.
top works. So so anyway, that's all.
So one thing I had to question about, some of these are actually just like practical questions of how did you figure out what to. Another thing I noticed that you also nailed, I think, with this bot network, mate, is I've noticed the accounts themselves. This is actually how I found most of the ones I follow. I didn't even know it was one guy making all these, or that initially that they were all the same person. I eventually obviously noticed it was the same pattern of the way they were structured and stuff. But the thing that clued me into it was, I think I just followed a couple that were like artists that I just found really striking the work. And then the key thing I noticed was, because obviously you have a lot of bots for this. If I just searched randomly on the bots, I'd probably quit in 5 minutes. Like maybe some of the art wouldn't be for me. But I noticed you seem to have coded these bots, so they do a very good job sharing the like-minded art or in a similar vein to the art bot that you're currently on. So if I'm on one that might be like, I mean, pick like a romanticism artist or something from Russia in the 19th century. It'll be retweeting another person like that or something a bit similar. How did you do that aspect? Because it seems like you did you understand social networks in that sense. I've noticed it seems like it's pretty right on as to what it sort of recommends and what the overlap is. It's not like you have like, the Van Gogh bot doesn't retweet like crazy art that's like drastically different, right?
Yeah, so when I started building out these accounts, right, I started with Kandinsky, and then I started, and as people followed these accounts, right, they would ask, hey, what about Malevich, or what about Paul Klee,
Right.
or what about Picasso? And so as I started adding those accounts as well, right, the next question in my mind was, well, what if these artists were alive today? Would they retweet each other?
Okay.
Would they follow each other? Right? Would they recommend each other? And so I started organizing them into stylistic clusters. So, for example, impressionists like Monet, Renoir, Mary Cassatt, they are in kind of like their own cluster, right? So they recommend each other, they retweet each other. Then you have post-impressionists, like you have Gauguin, Van Gogh, and then you take any style, and so I try to organize them by these stylistic clusters. And so when you follow Monet, right, you are most likely, when Monet is retweeting other accounts, those accounts are also post-impressionists.
Yes.
Now, I never wanted the system to be predictable or deterministic. And so I coded quite a bit of randomness into the process.
Okay.
And so if you follow Monet, right? Yeah, you get impressionists, but now and then you would get a post-impressionist or maybe a cubist, just to mix things up a little bit to challenge people's stylistic tastes.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's a bit of that. So kind of like the artists have their own immediate network, and then they have all these adjacent networks. So let me give you an example. For example, Pablo Picasso, right? He's mostly known for Cubism,
sure,
but he also started with realism, and his blue period, right, is closer to this post-impressionistic style, or you can like realism. And so if you follow him for Cubism, right, you're also going to get glimpses at his other work. And through that other work, maybe Picasso is also connected to a larger artistic network, so to speak.
Right.
So the artists evolve in their styles. And so when these bots recommend things or retweet things, so they don't just deterministically say, hey, retweet only Cubism. Retweet, maybe some adjacent artworks and styles, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, another thing, like I say, that I actually thought was quite clever about the whole system you designed is it actually does, as much as you say, the reason why the big art accounts just spam the same pitches is because they just only want clicks and engagement. Sure, you didn't go that route, but I think your understanding of like the networking angle was very good, mate, because what you're talking about right now actually has a vibe of like if people have used services like Spotify or YouTube, where now everyone knows the algorithms are amazing at recommending things that you haven't tried yet, but that you would like. Like one thing that tipped me off immediately that you were recorded before I even knew your background was that you did so religiously use hashtags for the sort of subgenre of painter, even because, like, for example, I remember one of the first people I found the bots for was an English artist I'd never heard of, mate, called John Atkinson Grimshaw, and he just does these sort of like amazing portrait landscape pieces of like nighttime and stuff. And it was only through that, mate, that I even discovered. As you say, I'm not like an art critic or some specialist. I just saw the hashtag was romanticism, clicked it, found all the other bots, which a lot of them admittedly are Russian or English artists, I noticed, and it turns out I didn't know this, but apparently romanticism is my jam. That's my subgenre, and so I've got all these artists I never would have even found in a million years. So I feel like that aspect. Do you find that that's caught on well? Has the approach been successful?
Yeah, I mean, partly, right. It's understanding how Twitter works and how these network effects work on Twitter as a platform, and then all I did, right, is I'm trying to mimic the behavior that successful social media accounts employ. So, for example, how many posts should you share? When should you share them? How do you tag these posts? How these artists follow each other? And so the idea was to, help people discover as much new art as possible. And so on Twitter, we're doing it through hashtags, recommendations, retweets, etc. But I'm glad to hear that you got into romanticism. That's quite a style to get into.
It's great though. So, I mean, just aesthetically, it just instantly appealed to me. Was like I say, I would maybe know a few famous artists, but I definitely would never know any of the genres or what I would like, or if I liked One Piece, or I like that style. Another thing I want to ask about, by the way, is, I mean, as you've said in some of your other pieces about how many millions and millions in artworks and stuff, you said you take recommendations. Is there actually any kind of criteria as to who makes the cut? Like, essentially, if someone's just a famous artist, do you have to in any way like them yourself? Do a certain number of people have to ask? Was there any threshold people had to meet before they got an artbot? Is there any specific people that didn't get an artbot out of artists, or are you going to put everyone on there if possible? What's the theory in that sense?
Well, Hitler did not get it.
Right, fair enough. Okay. Okay. So there is a threshold for some reason. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there are not too many people that did not get an artbot, right? Most artists, even the ones who are, right now considered, I don't know, like who are assholes, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Even
Sure,
those
for whatever
artists,
political
yeah,
reasons or whatever. Yeah, sure.
right, exactly. But no, like I make art, like, so I'm trying to remove as much of my personal bias out of it as possible. And so, for example, I am not really into romanticism. It's just not my style, right? I love German expressionism.
Okay.
And so for me, right, that there's not like a stylistic threshold. If an artist, so the first decision is, okay, is their work publicly available? Can I actually, is it publicly available, and can I share it without getting in trouble? So that's the first criteria. And some art foundations, they are fussy about people sharing their work online. I actually had to take a couple accounts down because I got a cease and desist letter
Oh wow. Okay.
from the artist's estate. I don't understand it, but so anyway, so is this work publicly available? Is this artist um is this artist, like, what's the level of notoriety, right? Like, um so I kind of try to use that. Those are the main criteria. And then the last criteria is that, hey, do I have enough time or resources to create yet another account?
Is it time consuming to do it?
Yeah, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of it just takes a lot of resources. So for example, right now, with Twitter, you have to have a phone number associated with each new
Oh,
Twitter
I can see what
account.
hassle
And
it be
so,
then, right? Okay.
yeah, so all of a sudden, right, this, the future of this project is uncertain because, well, yeah, I can register 10 accounts or verify 10 accounts with my first personal phone number. Maybe I can ask my friends, but when it comes to verifying 500 accounts and
Yes.
managing all that, that becomes unmanageable. So there's like big investment in time, big investment. It's just like time and resources.
You know, one thing about that I'd never actually thought of is it's funny because in any other era, if you tried to share all this art, you also would run into certain problems. It's just back then it would be things like political or religious persecution. But now the joke is like, it seems like you still have problems, but they're based around things like people just are very suspicious of bot behavior or there are copyright concerns. Like the joke is like in some way art always gets suppressed by something. It feels like you got your own problems to run into, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's they're also there are also political concerns as well. For example, some of these museum collections, right? They share art that might is either inappropriate or inappropriate for the moment, or
Sure.
and so anyway, so like for example with romanticism, right? Some of the depictions of the East or the Africa, right, can be viewed as, oh, like this is colonial view of the world,
Oh,
and
right.
so
I
a lot of
see.
people,
Right.
yeah, don't like it. But anyway, I do think that the challenge for a project like this is that it doesn't there's not like a clear business model, or right, like
Yes.
somebody has to pay for it, somebody has to be in charge of it. And so um yeah, and then on top of it, right, like all the challenges that Twitter and other social media networks represent. So before the restriction with phone numbers on accounts, there were all this issue about, hey, like, are these bots even legal, right? The legality of the bots.
Yes.
There's also an issue of nudity. In the early days, a lot of the art accounts were banned because of
Oh, they're getting
porn.
flagged by the bots, and right. I see. Right.
Yeah, I'm using air quotes, like, for the
Right. Yeah.
porn.
Yeah.
As
Sure.
you can imagine, a lot of religious paintings, there's a lot of nudity and
Yeah. Of
violence,
course.
right?
Yeah.
And I got banned from Facebook probably more than 10 times for, either posting what was perceived as pornography or graphic violence, where it was just like a religious painting of a beheading.
Sure.
Right?
Yes. By the way, one thing, now we can move a little bit more into, actually, I want to get your take on what you think of art and your background. So one thing I want to ask was, I noticed a very curious thing you said in an article online when someone was talking to you about this project, where you actually, I thought it was quite cool, because in the modern day, so I know you must be from a similar era as me, you described the premise of, when you described yourself as a hacker, you meant like the old school, like 70s and 80s definition, where it basically means someone who's like a programmer who finds solutions to problems, like takes things, meddles with them, tweaks them, and changes them to do what they want them to do, right? Whereas obviously, especially in the modern day, if you said to someone is a Russian hacker, it would have a very different message, as you joked about in your sort of like 4 TED talk. So what I want to ask about was that is, if you're someone who knows a little bit about that world and you're in the programming world and you've come up with this free solution for the world in this sense, it almost implies to me, without making it sound like it's a political thing, is this sort of your message to the world? Like, this is your way of sort of expressing yourself through other people's art? It sounds like this is some sort of a social push more than just, here's some accounts, right? Is there an element of, because if people don't know, a lot of people from the hacking and the programming world believe in very, I would say, very distinct political principles, like maybe information should be free, or, when technological solutions exist so anyone could encounter like things like art and ideas, maybe we should allow as many people as possible to have them. Was there some of that involved with this idea?
Maybe, but not, it wasn't conscious, right? It wasn't that I was, that I set out to do, like, I set out on a mission. I did have this, this almost disappointment that I felt with social media, right? When, in the early ages of social networks, it was this expectation that we're going to connect the world. We're going to connect different perspectives, right?
Yes.
We're going to, all of the world's information will be available and free and accessible. And the reality is that, none of the art is shared, none of the literature is shared. So instead of sharing this rich cultural heritage, right, like this just knowledge that we accumulated over the years, we ended up sharing just stupid memes and using it to fight, right? And
yes.
My philosophy with the bots and with art in general, right? Like, we don't need to put it in a glass box. We don't need to put it on a pedestal. It's Kandinsky is, belongs on Twitter or Instagram just as much as, I don't know, somebody's selfie, right? And so,
yes.
And you don't need to have a special art education to appreciate art or to learn about it. It's literally whether you like it or not. You see something, oh, I love this painting. I don't know why, so I'm going to give it a like. Or you see something that doesn't speak to you and you scroll past it. And so for me, the idea, the biggest criticism from almost like the art establishment I've received over the years is that these bots, they cheapen the experience. That somehow by experiencing art on social media and not in a curated setting, is somehow devaluing it. And I disagree with that approach, right? I do think that art is art, right? It doesn't need to be explained. It doesn't need to be shown in this, curated environment. You either like it or you don't, and then this is how you find your way, right? Like, maybe you didn't even realize that you were into romanticism, but a couple clicks and you were like, oh, I really love this.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, yes, there was a bit of philosophy, but like the hacker ethos, right? That like the information should be free, information should be accessible. I definitely subscribe to that.
Yeah, one thing I would even say, and I'll even address this in part in response, as you said, to the the critics, who, by the way, they've made such a caricature of themselves there, what you'd think an art critic would be like, by basically being snobby and sort of being like, but you're not seeing it in the museum. It's like, guys, yeah. Here's the thing, I sort of know what they mean. Like, I'm sure these artworks are more incredible if you see them up close in person, you're a meter away, you have all time. But I would just say this, mate, I would have never found some of this art. I'm just a guy on Twitter. Like, I would say it's a different way of finding it. And in fact, I would absolutely say, without making it sound overly grand, I actually think the impact of your project is potentially life-changing, because in my own experience, I'll just give you a little background, because I'm someone who for my work is online a lot, and Twitter particularly is something I like to use to find out what's going on. I've over the last few years, I've been intentionally trying to remove negative inputs from my social media experience, take away some of the political arguing and things you referenced earlier, or accounts which, you know, they seem interesting, but then you find out it's mainly just a negative slant. And one of the things I tried to do was, especially when I found all of your bots, especially, but before that, I would try it with, you know, famous quote accounts and stuff, was try and fill as much of my sort of feed with really cool, inspirational, aspirational stuff, things that are just like moments of art, a cool little 70s rock song, a quote from someone famous. I found if I did that, it genuinely is life-changing, but in a way that's on the minor level. It's just on your moment-to-moment experience. I feel like it brought a bit more light into my life. It lifted the mood a bit. It made social media not feel so dark. I mean, you know, people say that phrase like doom scrolling. Twitter especially can feel like that, mate. So was this also something you were going for? Like, you're trying to sort of like just enriching the outside, sort of the outskirts of people's lives as they go through social media?
Well, I started with doing it for my life, right? Because
sure.
at the beginning of this journey, right, I had the same thing. I had this desire. I was like, how do I connect with art? How do I bring more art into my life? And this was a solution that I built for a problem that I personally had. And the cool part about the social media, right, is that, you know, you don't need my permission to follow these bots and just get, and it doesn't detract from my experience, when you experience or have a good time as well. And so it definitely started with that intention in mind of enriching my life. And I am so happy to hear that, you know, you found these accounts inspirational, and they brought you joy.
I'm sure you must get so many messages though, right? With how many accounts there are. I'm sure it's a pretty common response you've had, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's I'm surprised by it, by the impact, because to me it's completely invisible, right? Like, unless someone reaches out, I don't. It's really hard, and this is what's really strange about this project, is these accounts, they're followed on Twitter by close to 7 million people or accounts.
Wow.
But I don't I never see it, right? So for me, it's really hard to gauge the impact that this project has. So so it's really rewarding, but it's also like, oh, cool, that's not something that I expected.
Fair enough. Also, by the way, on that line of the art critics, the other thing I would say in that sense is, like I said before, not only would people not even know these artists existed, but you have to go out of your way to go and pick out an art book or to search for a certain person or go to a gallery. I think another thing that's very cool about this experience is I'm essentially passively discovering artists that I never would have checked out otherwise, or work of art from someone, but it's a less famous piece or a sketch. So I find that part's very rewarding too, because it feels like essentially, instead of my time online being mostly a waste of time, it's given me a value add at most occasions, it feels like.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that experience too, because I follow a lot of these accounts, and the interesting side effect, right? Like, as a counterpoint to the art critic, I actually been going to a lot more museums, because I'm more curious to see some of this art in person.
Yes.
And so I've been. And it's really rewarding, right? When you get into an art museum and you're like, oh, I know that piece because I follow this artist on Twitter, and yeah, it's seeing a piece live is definitely is a very different experience from seeing it on screen. But the emotional reward, almost like this hit of dopamine when you're like, oh, I know who that is, I know the style. I just feel like it makes the experience of a museum better.
Sure. By the way, I did want to ask some questions now to relate it to your own experience of life and art. So in all these articles written about you, they always say that you grew up around art or art was in your family, etc. I saw that it said that your sister was an artist. Can you expand on that a little bit more? Did this mean when you were growing up, like your direct family members were into art? Was there just people doing it around you? What was art to you when you were young?
Yeah, I mean, so it was just something around. So my dad was an artist. He was, a member of the art community, and so a lot of his friends were artists. I spent a lot of time in his studio, and so it was just normal, right? Like doing art was a thing. I thought everybody did. And then as I was growing up, my sister became an artist. And then I myself studied art, studied art in college before I switched to software engineering.
And what about were you someone who, when you started out on this project, did you actually know a lot of these artists initially? Because, for example, one thing I was interested in with the fact that your background was Russian is actually within the Romanticism genre. Like I said, I knew like a lot of them would be English. Like I knew a little bit about English art history, but I know very little about Russian art history. And I was amazed how many Russian artists there are in there. So suddenly, apparently, I'm into Russian art. Like, did you already know a lot of these people? Were you versed in like the Russian schools of art at all?
Not really. I mean, I knew some, right? But having studied art history in Russia, but I was never into it. And the interesting part, I actually discovered a lot of new artists, and like my knowledge of art history and art genres was kind of rudimentary, right? Like I knew the difference between impressionism and post-impressionism, but it was more of a trying to find a way to say it. It was more kind of like on the intellectual level, right?
Okay.
Like I didn't spend as much time looking at art and
Yes.
really digging into it. And so, but through this project, because people would reach out and they would say, "Hey, you're doing surrealism. How about this Mexican surrealist painter?" And I was like, "Whoa, I actually never knew of her." And so I would go do research, learn about her work, and then make an artbot for her. And so for me, this journey was also the one of discovery and learning.
Along those lines, actually, another thing I found that's been very rewarding about just experiencing all this art myself is another thing that naturally I would have said would have put me off the idea of getting into art as some sort of a hobby is I did think it was some sort of like an over intellectualized bit of a snobby hobby for people who have money and can go to art galleries. So I would have thought, first of all, it's not for me. And then secondly, I had that silly image from a movie, like a TV trope, that you go and you look at a picture that you don't really sort of necessarily like, but you're supposed to intellectually think, what was the artist trying to convey here? Whereas I've found one thing I love about the art from all the bots you're posting, mate, is I don't even have to engage intellectually. What I do is I genuinely, first of all, aesthetically, a lot of them speak to me in the ones that I like. So I'm getting like almost a visceral appreciation that I never got before. And then secondly, I don't actually find I ever do think things like that. I just sort of feel like, what does it make me feel like? I think I've almost like de-intellectualized it, but it makes it feel better. I wondered what your experience of having seen so much art now, how do you think you relate to it?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's exactly like that, right? It's like I don't think art should be explained. I think that the explanation comes later, right? It has to, like, first you get interested, and what reels you in is that artwork that speaks to you, right? You see it and you're like, oh, that's kind of cool, and you like spend time looking at it. Uh, the intellectual journey starts later. To me, that's like the second
Right.
step, right? Where like in the traditional world, I feel like it's flipped, right? First,
Yes.
we're like have to learn the theory and have to learn about all the stuff, and then and I just do think that like I like the messiness of social media, right?
Yes.
I like that it's a bit of a dumpster fire, because to me that's kind of like the environment in which art thrives. the curated and like the almost like this dead experience of a museum, right? Where everybody is whispering, where the experience is highly curated. To me, that's yeah, like maybe that's a good place to appreciate art, but that's not the place where art is created, right? Like art loves this petri dish of ideas and different like different people coming together, and just art is messy ultimately. And one thing I hope that this project achieves, right? It shows that it's like we put these artworks on some sort of a pedestal, but like in reality the artist just wanted to create something beautiful and cool, and like how awesome that hundreds of years later this art is still shared, people are still looking at it and discovering it and talking about it. I think that personally, I think it's pretty cool.
That's awesome, yeah. Another thing I'll also say, if someone out there is listening and they maybe haven't even seen these bots, or don't know what we're talking about, and maybe they were in a similar position I was, they were just somewhat ignorant of the field and thought maybe that sort of art isn't for me. All I would say is the best thing is, as we're saying, don't do it the way you think you have to. Don't go and get a book about Van Gogh and think, right, I better learn what this art's all about. Maybe Van Gogh doesn't speak to you. Just click on a bunch of the accounts and just wait until one speaks to you. That would be my advice generally. Just find the first one where immediately even the image is like, oh, this is interesting. And then as we've been discussing in this conversation, click on the related accounts, click on the hashtag, you look around. I'm almost certain, like genuinely, I would have thought before, Andrea, there are certain people who are into art and aren't. After my own experience of this and from retweeting it and seeing my network of people get into this art, I think everyone could find some artists they like. The breadth is so incredible, the amount of bots you've got.
Appreciate it. And yes, I 100% support that. Go follow an artist, unfollow them if you don't like them, but see if you can find something that speaks to you. There right now, I think around 500 accounts on Twitter alone, so I'm sure you can find something.
One thing I want to ask you is, since you're coming from a programming background as well, in your work you're doing that, I don't know if you have a similar experience as me, but I know actually sometimes I think in the past, because I come from a background of more like technical in that respect, I would say in the past, I actually think I almost put myself in a genre. And like I said, I would have thought I'm not really an art guy, or, what's the point of it? What was he trying to say with this message? I actually feel like now what I'm discovering in part through art and this journey is sort of, like I said, aesthetics and things like, how does something make me feel? And I'm not really thinking about the function of it, or why was this form designed this way? I feel like I'm activating a different part of my human experience. What's your sense?
Yeah, I mean, what was interesting for me is that, like, as I looked at these paintings, right, as I wanted to, like, so for me, it kind of triggered this curiosity, right? Like, what were these artists like in real life? So for example, I really got into Van Gogh and I read a book about him, right? And all of a sudden, right, like, to me, it unlocked this new level of appreciation and understanding. Same as for Frida Kahlo, right? I was curious, like, I first got into her art, but then I was like, I'm really curious about this person who created all this. And so I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but
it's all right. Yeah.
It's but for me, right, it was first like, oh, cool artwork, and then, oh, I like it, and now I want to learn more as to like where this came from, if it makes sense.
Yeah, sure. One thing also as well I want to ask about is this, right? This is my own personal bias, but I do notice a lot of the art. Now, true, this is partly a technical solution. Obviously, a lot of these artworks weren't going to be easily found online because these people are all dead, like you've said. And technically, it's part of the loophole that lets you post the art. It's not modern stuff that's super copyrighted and people are as litigious about, hopefully. Obviously, you mentioned some exceptions. But obviously, a lot of this art is from past centuries, particularly like 19th, 18th, etc. One thing I would ask is this. This is one of the few questions that I guess does veer a little bit away from your philosophy that you want art to unite and not divide. But basically, I want to ask this. Another reason why I like to fill my feed with this type of artwork, and I've told you the sorts that I've been vibing with of the bots, etc., is because I actually do also want I want to sort of infuse the past into the present, the best parts of it in terms of this art. Because I don't know where you're at on this, but a lot of people comment that this is a cultural trend. I mean, you grew up in the Soviet Union, so you should know this better than anyone, of that kind of like modern, where it is just designed for the sake of form and it's brutalism. Obviously, a lot of the Soviet Union buildings look very ugly in that sense and didn't look like the palatial estates of France or whatever from the 17th century everyone loves to go and see. Do you have any thoughts on that, about the idea that in the modern day, people in some sense, it feels like modern art, I'm not talking about purely like literally the term modern art, but it feels like a lot of art and design and architecture now doesn't really seem to go into these elements that sort of uplift the spirit. I know I'm a bit vague on this. I want to get where your sense is, though. Are you trying to sort of make people return to the old era in that sense?
Not really. No, I am. In that sense, no. I see art as this as something constantly in motion. Things
Okay.
are evolving, right? It's not fixed in time, and so what I maybe if there's one big message, right, it's all about this fluidity of art, right? That all these like not no artwork exists on its own. All art is connected. So just like everybody, all these bots are connected on social media, right? You can hop from essentially from Andy Warhol to Leonardo da Vinci, probably
Yes.
in like few clicks. Same as like all of the stylistic, art styles. So you mentioned kind of like this utilitarian Soviet architecture style or
Yes.
Soviet design, and in the Russian avant-garde movement, right? Like in the early like 1920s and 1930s, like those artists, right? Like they were influenced by the time and by the trends in their time. And they started with like Kandinsky or Malevich, right? They started with, traditional art, but then they went into these pure forms and shapes. And so to me, right, it's like I want to show that if there's one message is that, hey, like art is constantly evolving and art is interconnected. And so whatever whatever the current style is, right? Like in architecture and
Sure.
design and in art, right? Like it's all part of that continuum. And maybe some of these artistic branches, right? Like they end up being these dead end evolutionary
Sure.
branches, but some lead to just to something else. So I I hope that these accounts help people see the bigger picture.
By the way, along those lines, I mean, that sense you're building up there of how art inspires others who then pick up the thread of something similar, and it's an evolving idea passing through time and people. In a sense, aren't you doing that by doing this project? Like, I'm sure the amount of people around the world who've already seen these images, it's affected their lives, it's maybe opened up their own interest in art. Maybe they've actually now explored more art themselves. Even though you're not literally the artist doing the art, in a sense, you are the person spreading it to others. So what do you think on that sense? I mean, it sounds like before, like you said, you downplayed it a bit by being like, it's a bit invisible to me. But if you try and grasp it in your mind, you're actually doing a pretty big thing, right?
I mean, yeah, it does have a big impact, and maybe in that sense, it's an art project because it's certainly not a commercial project. So sometimes I wish it was, but yeah, I mean, it is an art project, right? Like where my role is maybe a role of a like of a curator in a traditional world, right? But the curation is done not through me going, maybe the curation is done by these algorithms and by these social media networks and by what people like and don't like.
Sure. By the way, along those lines, since you referred earlier to how tricky it can be also to create all the accounts, and obviously in the modern day, like you said, this isn't a commercial project. It's not like you're trying to make millions off it. I actually had a question about that, which is that to this day still a conscious decision? Like, is it for some reason you've just decided it's not going to have any commercial aspect? Because when you were saying earlier about things like foundations maybe asking to take stuff down or complaints, a cynical person would say that's where you make the money, right? Like you make a deal, like, you know, like when people do quote accounts, for example, often they'll have a automatic reply to the quote where it spams a link for, could be a product, it might be something useful, but it might be like a book to do with that quote, you know. An obvious angle someone could do if they were cynical on yours is after each picture, you know, there's a bot, the bot then links to like, go to this art exhibit here and you have a deal with them, or buy this book on Amazon and you have an affiliate link or something. Have you ever considered that? Is there like some sort of a philosophical reason you don't want to do that?
No philosophical reason, right? Like I have to be careful of how I don't want to cheapen the experience, right? By selling like socks with Van Gogh paintings on them.
That's a good example.
So and this is something that's, you know, people actually approach me about. So that's one thing. But then, and these bots, they do send out book recommendations that are linked to Amazon. But what I found, it's very difficult to turn this into a commercially viable or even sustainable project.
Okay.
And so there's this expectation that, you know, like Wikipedia is free, right? Like that this account should be free, and I agree with it. So, but like, how do you ensure the long-term sustainability of this project if it's essentially like a public good, and then nobody wants to pay for it? So that is definitely a challenge that I'm currently facing. So it wasn't a conscious decision to like, oh, I'm never going to make money from it. It's right. You know, I tried different areas because just to give you an example, right? Like these bots, it costs money to run them. So, and it costs on the order of tens of thousands of dollars a year. And I've been, funding the project myself. I've obviously built it myself, and you know, like me and my co-founder, we've been at it for a while. But there is, you know, right now, for example, Twitter makes it really hard to create these accounts, or whenever they lock an account, we have to go and provide a phone number and like follow the steps to unlock it.
Sure.
And so there's a real opportunity cost for us in terms of, hey, how much time can we invest, and does it actually like make sense for us to keep this project alive? Because just because of the investment required.
Along those lines, like I notice you also are involved with some like Web3 projects and NFT stuff, which I hope you're making money through. But one thing I did wonder along those lines is there a reason you don't have some sort of like crowdfunding or even just like a donation? Like, but it is to me, that was one of the first things I thought of when I actually discovered your account, is if you'd have had some sort of like PayPal link, I might have chucked you something there. Like I said, it's enriched my experience, and I don't want it to go away. So is there something like that planned?
Yeah, so I mean, there's actually a way to donate through Patreon.
Oh, okay.
And it's Patreon/artbots. One word, no spaces. So there is a way to do it, but you see, it's when, like, I find it challenging, and I think that I find challenging. Like, what I find challenging is, how do you monetize a project like that shares art, right? Because inevitably people start viewing it as, hey, here's this guy. He is trying to make money off of these artists.
Right, I see, yes. Okay, they think you're exploiting someone else's work, basically.
Right, exactly. And so, anyway, so that's another consideration.
I mean, listen, I can understand why they might think that, but I would just say, like I said, to me, you're actually playing quite an essential role within it. Like, it's like that example of like, well, anyone could do it. It's like no one has. And as you said, you've done it at quite considerable cost. So like you are providing a service for people.
Well, I appreciate it. And yeah, we'd love if people supported this project. And we're actually, me and my co-founder, we're thinking about spinning this project into a separate thing. So it's kind of like becomes this public project. So maybe a DAO, or maybe, yeah, some sort of so it has an opportunity to live independently, and so it doesn't depend on me, right? So
Yes.
if somebody else wants to take it over and do something with it, they can.
One last thing I had to ask about, so we can wrap up after this. It basically goes like this. Even though, look, aside from the literal time it takes, and as you say, it can be quite tedious to make all the accounts, and obviously you have to search out all the art. The actual like technology obviously makes all this relatively easy in the sense that like once the account's created, the bot's programmed, it can just go on its own. Right. This makes me think that, bear in mind, you're just a guy who had this idea, found the art, set it up, started going. Don't you feel like if people do similar things in other fields, like it actually feels like essentially the message to people should be, it's not, you don't have to be some enormous person with enormous resources to potentially have enormous impact on the world, right? Like I feel like if someone did this, obviously they'd have to do it in a different sense, but if they did it in the world of music or other things, like I say, it can have an individually life-changing effect. What do you think on this regard?
Yes, absolutely, right. And this is the promise of technology, that like one person can use social media as this multiplier and have an outsized impact. And to me, that's definitely like a positive message in all of this, right? That it's completely permissionless. You don't need to ask permission from, like, I didn't go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and asked if they could share the work, right? The art is in public domain. It's publicly available. It's free to share, and I'm sure the same is with all kinds of other content. And just go and do it. Go and share it. And in Silicon Valley, they have the saying, right? Like asking for like apologizing is, or like whatever, like asking for forgiveness is easier than asking for permission.
Yes.
So
yes.
It's a good line. Yeah, just embrace that hacker ethos, right? Go and even if the idea is not fully hashed in your mind, even if there's some unknowns, right? Go try it and go experiment and see what happens.
Спасибо большое.
Oh, пожалуйста.
Here at Thorin's side, I have people on my side, both literally and metaphorically, because this video and all of the content on my channel is kindly supported by my Patreon community. Would you like to get teasers for my upcoming content and see who the next guests are for my interview series? Do you want to ask me a question in my monthly video AMA? Maybe you want to select between the topics I'm going to do for my next solo video. Or perhaps you are excited by the idea of a private, exclusive, never to be published personal discussion with yours truly. Well, if so, heed this call to action and join Thorin's side today via the Patreon link in the description box below.